Good evening and welcome to the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm Tatiana Serafin, Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council, along with Nick, who's out based in DC.
Good evening, everyone.
And we are so excited to welcome back for their second appearance, second and one of three, and we'll tee up what that means in a second, Admiral James Stavridis, partner and vice chair of the Global Affairs at the Carlyle Group and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation, following 5 years as the 12th dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Tufts, which is an Easter egg in your book, and we'll talk more about that too. And his co-partner and co-writer and Elliot Ackerman, author of the many novels, Halcyon, Red Dress in Black and White, Waiting for Eden, former Marine, and two wonderful partners here to talk about 2054, but also I have to put next to each other 2034, and we can talk about the red and white of it all as well. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss your new book, 2054, and how it ties in together to the trilogy you're working on. So I do want to start out with that because it fascinates me the way that authors put together a series of books. And so maybe, Elliot, could you tell us how you decided that this was going to be a set of three and where this one fits and how you kind of have planned it out? Or can you plan this at all? Or is it just come from within?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having us, and it's great to be back with the Carnegie Council. These books were always planned as a series and a trilogy that would really look at what we predict will be the three great challenges, not only facing the United States but really facing our species in the 21st century. The first of which being a peer level conflict that we see in 2034 between the United States and China, as well as on the technological side, developments in cyber. And then the second that we address in 2054 are the challenges posed by artificial intelligence and the idea of what you write about of the singularity. We can probably get into that a little bit more later, but also how that coincides with challenges that we see at home in our democracy. And then the last in this planned trilogy, 2084, which will be out in a couple of years, will deal with the environment. So when it came to these books, it was always envisioned that they would be a trilogy. And we've sort of had a lot of fun imagining three cautionary tales on these subjects.
Yeah, can I just add a thought which is simple? And Elliot used the word, this is cautionary fiction, not predictive fiction. We still have time to kind of reverse engineer and avoid these catastrophes. That's really the point of the series. And our inspiration for it was Cold War literature. If you look back and think about all the cautionary tales of Red Storm Rising, the Third World War by Sir John Hackett, On the Beach by Neville Shute, all of this cautionary fiction, kind of the queen of all those would be Dr. Strangelove. All that was intended to frighten us to avoid a war between the US and the Soviet Union. Same idea here, except spread out over the century.
I know that there's been a lot of focus on the technology side, but before we get into that, can I ask you a bit about the politics? Because even though this is set in the future, the politics seem a bit closer to us. A rise of authoritarianism in the United States, dysfunctional politics, and so on. And so while you're writing about a cautionary tale about technology and geopolitics, can you maybe address as well the authoritarian subtext that the United States of 2054 is not a liberal democracy, and how you chose to set the world of 2054 in an environment where the forms of the republic may be there, but our politics have changed quite dramatically?
I think the one thing invariable that is the through line through all of these books is humanity itself. And so we are the control, we are changeless. Um, 2054 is very much a political thriller that, in some ways, probably echoes Julius Caesar. And the book begins with a political assassination, except in our case, it's not a dagger; it is a piece of technology. So, with regards to the politics, although it certainly echoes some of the trends we see in American political life today. For instance, the fact that the two major parties have lost membership and have really become rump parties, and most Americans don't identify with them. And it also deals with a president who doesn't want to relinquish power at the opening of the book. Um, you know, I think these are themes that, as much as they resonate today, they've resonated throughout all time in politics. And I think we imagine that in the future, we'll probably be wrestling with the exact same challenges.
I think that what's so interesting is how much everything that you write feels like it is of today. So I know conceptually I'm reading about 2054, and there's some really cool tech that you guys envision, and cool changes to airplane travel. And I'm not going to give away more because I want people to read the book and read your vision in the book. But how much stays the same, to your point, Elliot, is the interesting part, that people are still motivated by the same drivers. And one thing that struck me, and maybe Elliot, you can take this, but is that casinos are still really an important part of life and how people communicate. And I don't know, I just kept seeing casinos pop up, and I'm like, oh, look, they're still around in 2054.
Sure. Well, one of the principal characters, who is a scientist and a Japanese American, he's also an avid gambler. And I think when Jim and I set out to write this series, there were a few things we were immediately aligned on. I mean, first of all, we were aligned on the purpose of this series, that these would be three works of cautionary fiction, very much in the spirit of Cold War fiction, which we already discussed. But at least from a creative standpoint, we were immediately aligned on the fact that these were going to be novels that were character driven, that we wanted you, the reader, as much as you're engaging with the policy ideas that are in the books, you're also engaging and getting to know characters, some of whom come forward from 2034 into 2054. And I'll preview some of whom and their progeny are in 2084. And so, in wanting to create, human beings, we kind of looked at what are some of the consistent human variables, and I think one of them, sure, is an appetite for risk, an appetite for risky behavior, which we see not only in the casinos featured in the books, but in some of the geopolitical and domestic political decisions that the principal actors are taking.
Admiral, I want to ask, in terms of characters, we talked in our last book talk with you about which characters you most associated with in 2034. And I'm wondering, is there any particular character that stands out to you in this that is more of you a little bit?
I think the character I like to think I'm the closest to is Rear Admiral Bunt Hendrickson, who is a graduate of our shared alma mater, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Check. He works at the National Security Council staff. Check. He's an admiral. Check. And I like to think of Bunt. By the way, he gets that nickname because that's the only thing he's good at doing on a softball field. Check. So I like Bunt a lot, and he also is kind of a voice of reason who helps guide this very turbulent journey. And he's also very caring about his goddaughter, Julia Hunt, who's the Marine junior officer, who really is the centerpiece of the novel in many ways. So I'd have to say in this one, it's Admiral Bunt Hendrickson is kind of my favorite. By the way, Bunt is not the tallest guy in the world. Check.
How about you, Elliot?
I think one of the things that's been really fun in doing this series is I've written other novels on my own, and people will sometimes ask me about the characters and whether or not what parts of those characters are me or not me, and I often say they're kind of all me. But the thing that's been so great about this book is they're not all me. They're all sort of both of us, and so I think it's been fun to create characters that very much come from two different people. I think one of the characters that I loved helping create was Lily Bao, who is the daughter of Lin Bao, who is the Chinese admiral, who's a very central figure in 2034. And I hope not without revealing too much for folks who might not have read 2034, but he sort of has a tragic character arc. But his daughter lives forward, and when you meet her, she is an immigrant to the United States who's made her way here. And in the first scene you see her, she's done quite well. She's working in private equity, but you see her in a hotel room, and she's having an affair. And as her lover, who becomes also a central character in the book, is leaving, you see that she's making the bed in this 5-star hotel room because her mother made beds in hotel rooms, and she can't bring herself to leave an unmade bed in a hotel room. So the idea of following these characters over decades, has been really rewarding to me, and inevitably you kind of come to become very fond of all of them.
Yeah, and I would just add, beyond fond, I love some of these characters, and every time I go back and read 2034, and I particularly focus on a character who has a tragic arc, as Elliot said, that's writer speak for dead, and and I feel I choke up. I literally do, and I've read the book too many times to count, but I feel very moved at the ending of particularly of Admiral Lin Bao.
We had. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tatiana.
Go ahead. No.
We had Amy Webb on a previous episode from the Genesis Machine, and really laying out this world of synthetic biology and engineering diseases, engineering cures, lifespan expansion. That was, in the abstract, that was pretty scary stuff. To see it as you've used it here almost makes me think, in a work of cautionary fiction, are you advising perhaps that we shouldn't go down certain roads that science may be taking us down because we're not ready for it, or because you can see some of these negative consequences? Or is this the cautionary tale of the genie is out of the bottle, just as with Oppenheimer in 1945? We have to learn to live with these new technologies and make sure that they aren't so destructive to the human race.
Yeah, it's very much the latter. And Nick, if you could just direct the question to me or Elliot, it'll keep our flow going better. I find, as I look at the synthetic biology and what is the singularity, which is really this merge of the human physiognomy with technology, which was, of course, predicted 20 years ago by Ray Kurzweil, who's also a character in the book, kind of delightfully. He wrote, the singularity is near. Well, in 2054, it's not near, it's here. And so that idea is very central. And I try to think, Nick, what are other inventions like that in history? And I go back to, for example, the printing press. It comes out. You could easily spin the case that this is going to be an incredibly dangerous invention, because it's going to put mass learning in the hands of everybody. And sooner or later, people are going to want to learn how to read. Everyone's going to read. Everyone's going to write. Everyone's going to have books. How dangerous is that? And it is dangerous. And a lot of bad things have come as a result of printing presses. On the other hand, so many marvelous things have come, because we can now, like Tatiana is, sit in a library and have human knowledge physically arrayed behind us in beautiful spaces. So printing press, electricity, the internet itself, as you said, Nick, nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And now it's artificial intelligence and eventually the singularity. It will come with some malevolence, but it will also create enormous moments of compassion, benevolence, and real achievement for the human race. So it's here. We've got to steer it as best we can. And what Elliot and I try to do in 2054 is to tell you, to warn you what could happen if we don't steer it. Ultimately, quite dangerous potentially.
Yeah. I would just add, if you remember the myth of Pandora and her box, when she opens her box, all the evils of the world flood out. And of course, technology, any technology from the Industrial Revolution, the Internet age, to the singularity is a sort of Pandora's box. But if you look back at that myth, people often forget that after all of the evils of the world leave Pandora's box, there's one thing left in the box, and that's hope. And so I think, as we wrestle these technologies, yes, there's a lot of noise that comes out of the box, but probably left there at the very bottom of it is this sort of kernel of human hope.
Speaking of hope, and Admiral, this book is a little bit, to me, more hopeful than 2034. I don't know, but it did feel, and here, and without giving anything away, there is a bit of, after what happens in 2034, there's a rejuvenation happening. Mm-hmm. Even though there's many bad things happening, there's a rejuvenation happening, that people continue to live and move forward. And speaking of hope, Elliot, I found that hopeful. And Admiral, do you think that you felt more hopeful writing this book, or how did you manage that?
We did. I certainly did. The first book is not apocalyptic, obviously, because there's a second book. You know that the world doesn't end at the end of the first book, right? But both nations are very damaged. Sometimes people say to me about the first book, "Oh, well, you're trying to write like Tom Clancy," and that makes my head explode. Tom Clancy is good guys and bad guys, and the good guys win in the end, normally in the last 15 minutes. And that's entertaining. It's fine. 2034 does not have good guys and bad guys. It has a villain, and the villain is war. And so, just as this is the opposite of a lighthearted opera, at the end of this kind of 2034, there is loss, there is pain, there is setback. So yes, 2054, which is another 20 years on, is about coming back from that. And when you do that, however, you often find yourself with the kind of challenges that Elliot articulated a moment ago with the political system, kind of pulling itself apart. And that, I think, is the real cautionary thread that runs through it alongside the artificial intelligence. But yeah, I think, Tatiana, this is a more hopeful book and less of a kinetic book about a war and its outcome. Nick, I think it's over to you to ask a question.
Oh, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, got you loud and clear.
Dude, that was maybe one of your nefarious actors interfering, or AI. It was AI. I want to go along with that thread of hope and how it plays out, and that there's no bad and good guys, because it seems like there's a new world order. And Elliot, I was looking at our transcript from 2034, and there was a question from an audience member then, why didn't you include Europe in that? And, the answer was, we can only include so many countries. In 2034, China, India, Russia, US, right there, that was enough, or Iran, enough. And here we have, and you mentioned that you would include more countries, and we see the rise of Japan and Brazil and Nigeria. And I just found that so fascinating. Elliot, how did you grab these countries into our new fold in 2054?
Well, I think we we're trying to project out and see where the world is going. And if we look at demographic trends, it becomes, very obvious that those countries are going to be significant players as we get to mid-century. And when it comes to the technology featured in 2054, particularly the rise of biotech, if those countries are going to be players by the mid-century, it also seems obvious that they're going to be engaged in sort of technological arms race that we predict in 2054, in which each nation is trying to arrive at the type of exponential growth that you see when you harness the power of technologies like quantum computing, for instance, in which there can be, vast accelerations in human knowledge in a relatively short amount of time, so that whoever gets there first really then kind of just shoots to the stratosphere in terms of knowledge and advancement. So I think it felt really important for us to make sure that we were predicting kind of where demographics were going to take the power centers of the world. And it didn't feel like it was going to necessarily be a particularly European focused or China focused world at mid-century. It felt like a lot of these nations, as you mentioned, like Brazil and Nigeria, were going to be really key actors. And so we needed to put them on the center stage.
Yeah, just to add a thought there, Japan obviously has declining demographics, but we include them not because we think their demographics are going to suddenly turn around, but because they are being so thoughtful and so intentioned about how they are going to use robotics, artificial intelligence, and these other technologies to compensate for those declining demographics. So two different sort of national characters there, the Brazil and Nigeria rising because of demographics, Japan rising because of being so coherent and thoughtful in dealing with declining demographics. I don't think that will happen with the Europeans, with Russia certainly not, probably not the United States, but those are the two sets by mid-century we think will be the real players.
I mean, I was very struck by that, Admiral, and I really commend both of you so often. And I was just in some strategy meetings today, and we talk about multipolarity, we talk about the rise of the global South, and that oftentimes that just really still looks like a Euro-Atlantic world with a few extra add-ons to it. And this really, I think, is striking that, as you said, it's not that Europe is gone, but that the movers and shakers have shifted south and east. And to have that in a way that does not still say, and by the way, we're still going to really have Europe be at the center of attention, I think is a very striking frame that you put in there. Perhaps out of the realm of the book and perhaps directed specifically to you, Admiral, do you think the United States is configured at this point, given your long period of service, both as Southcom commander and then as EUCOM commander, to manage a shift of as the center of gravity in the world shifts from the Euro-Atlantic basin to the south, to the east? Are we set up in the coming years to anticipate that? Or are we just simply going to react and others will drive the agenda?
I think, unfortunately, we have yet to create a coherent national strategy that gets out in front of that, particularly in the Pacific. And I know you have, and your work at the Naval War College, I have been onto this for a long time. Several administrations have tried this Pacific pivot, and yet we always seem to be dragged back to the Euro-Atlantic, thank you, Vladimir Putin, or most classically back to the Middle East with yet another enormous eruption there. We're like a car that kind of keeps wanting to get going to the west, but somebody is putting the brakes every time we try to do so. What we need, I think, is something China has, which is a highly developed, linear, out into the future strategy that takes into account all of the kind of changes we're talking about and positions itself in articulate ways for that. I think we have yet to do that. And I think as we look forward at this century, as it unspools, we've got to put that at the top of the list. And that's kind of why we addressed that first in 2034. That's the first of the evils out of Pandora's box that we're going to have to neutralize before we even get to the events of 2054.
What was really interesting, and maybe Elliot, you can take this question, is the central role that governments and government figures play, both in the U.S. and abroad. And I'm curious because in a world where we're dominated with news of Musk and Bezos, and tech companies, not that there wasn't a company that was very important in 2054, not giving anything away, but it seems that governments are driving the bus. And many times I hear from students that that's not who they feel is driving the bus. They feel, that, my friend TikTok is driving the bus, and, my billionaire friend, not that they're friends, but that's who we look towards and for. So I wonder, how you chose to stay in that realm. Was it a conscious choice, Elliot, or did you want to include business in that one company that appears in 2054? How did you balance that?
Sure. I think we wanted to show, and I think you do see it in the book, there's the Tandava group, which is a character from 2034 who, when you meet him in the first book, is working at the White House. And then after sort of the calamitous events that occur between the US and China, he is Indian American. And when you meet him at the opening of 2054, he's much older. He's actually sort of in poor health, but he is now sitting atop a massive private equity empire. And his group is called the Tandava Group, which comes from Hinduism. Tandava is sort of this ritual dance of creation and destruction, which is very much sort of the process through which his private equity empire works. And you see how Tandava engages with governments in the advancement of technology. And the governments are still playing a very central role, but they're really acting in many ways as the propellant to just really advance the technologies they feel are worth betting on. So I think, we see the private public interplay, but ultimately it becomes a technological race between nations, because the stakes are set so high, and whoever can really dominate artificial intelligence and arrive at this point, which is the integration of human consciousness and technological consciousness first, is going to have such a vast advantage over nations that have not arrived. So by definition, because it's sort of a zero-sum game, it falls into the realm of great power politics.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Elliot, just to build on that, I think it's interesting to see that, after 30 years or so in the US context, certainly it's always been in the European and in the Chinese context, that we're comfortable uttering the words in Washington, industrial policy or technology policy, where we don't just simply say, we'll let someone in Silicon Valley handle it. So I think that's a very interesting point, that you're seeing this, or you're projecting out in 2054 how this may play out. The other thing I just as a note, and just to commend you on, it's always a pleasure to read national security books where the characters look like America, in the diversity of America, rather than following sort of the traditional stereotypes of American military and diplomats and government officials all sort of hailing from the northeastern corridor with maybe an occasional southerner. And I think this point that, including that the changes in American demographics mean that we are going to have more senior officials whose ancestry doesn't come from Europe, comes from the Middle East, comes from South Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly Latin America. So again, that's something that I really enjoyed reading it, which is to see these characters that you draw from the richness of the tapestry of American life.
Yeah, I think this is a point to answer a question I get a lot. I'm sure Elliot does as well, which is, why fiction? If you want to write a book about a war with China, or a book about the danger of artificial intelligence, or the third volume is going to deal with climate and the terrible consequences of failing to reverse engineer the climate challenges we have, why don't you just write a nonfiction book where you lay out the policy, and everybody on this on this grouping has written books of nonfiction. I've written 10, I think. And the short answer is what you just said, Nick, which is you can freight these ideas and put them on the backs of real characters, and people respond to that. And they think about it, I think, in deeper and more real ways. And then secondly, it's great to get out of the straitjacket of nonfiction, where you got to footnote everything and it's all got to be perfectly accurate. And 20 years from now, someone's going to go back in and say, you didn't footnote this properly. It's a dangerous minefield out there in nonfiction. And in fiction, you can really splash a little more paint around the canvas. And then third and finally, fiction just gets a bigger audience, frankly. At the end of the day, you can write a wonderful policy book and, 1,000 people will read it. I think 2034 has been read by 400,000 people now. We're just not going to get that writing yet another policy book about avoiding a war with China.
At this point, I would like to welcome questions from our audience. So please feel free to put your question in the chat and we will get to them as they come in. Thank you again for joining us. We are talking about 2054 by Admiral James Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman, just showing you the cover again. I want to so I was reading the transcript from our last talk, and we discussed how the media was not really part of 2034, but boy, sure did it play a huge role in 2054. It is Elliot all over. And as a journalist, tell me, was that how conscious was it, or was it because this is so tech AI driven and you had to include the misinformation, disinformation that we're hearing today in kind of everything from this? I just saw a piece about Russia putting fake YouTube people to give disinformation about Ukraine, to Kate Middleton's photoshopped, picture, right? Like it's everywhere. What was the role and how did you see the news media in this book?
I think, as we already mentioned, right, artificial intelligence is a sort of a central theme in the book, and also this idea of the singularity, kind of the moment when biological and technological evolution start to merge, when molecules and molecules and microchips become almost indistinguishable from one another. And so when that boundary between the technological and biological becomes porous, I think what follows is the boundary between our lived reality and our manufactured reality also starts to become porous and easily manipulated. And so it becomes very obvious then that questions, in terms of the media enter. And I mean, we're already seeing this now. I mean, how many people, and how many publications have lamented the fact that, there are two Americas living in two widely divergent realities, consuming very divergent sources of news. And so if you just take those trends and extrapolate them further, it hits on, I think, one of the great challenges that's going to exist in this 21st century, which is how do we have a democratic society and exist in a democracy where there isn't, at least at a baseline level, a general consensus as to what is true and untrue. And so that's a central theme of 2054. No spoilers. It opens with the death of a president and a lot of questions about how that president died, who or what might have killed him. And the divergence in conclusions really takes the country up to the brink of a civil war. Some people think he was assassinated, some people think he just died, and they're willing to take that out into the streets. So, and I think that's something we're living with right now, is that divergent views on what is real and unreal are bringing our democracy, maybe not to a breaking point, but certainly putting us in some pretty uncomfortable situations.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Tatiana, you noticed this, but instead of having a press secretary in the White House, the person who's in charge of media is the Secretary of Press. And that's quite intentional. It's like the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of the Interior. Now we have a Secretary of Press. And I think that alone ought to indicate how we feel about the rise of the importance of media.
Yeah, and to that point, Admiral, there was a lot of writing in the book about manipulation and from the government side that I think caused me a lot of anxiety. And, and yet, it also heartened me to see that where were people getting information? There were scenes of airports and there were always news channels running. And so, that was kind of heartening. Oh, okay, we still need this thing called the press, but yet it can be so manipulated. And so I wonder, where do the characters land on that? Because they're using the press and they need it to give information, but is it a trusted source?
No, of course not. And there are no trusted sources today. And I think back to what Nick asked about a while back, about is this a book about the dangers of AI or the benefits of AI, or put it back in the bottle? The reality is AI is going to permeate every aspect of our lives. But where it might be most impactful is right here in the zone we're talking about, because it can shape everyone's perceptions. And in the book, there's a lot of kind of traditional shaping, and the woman who is the Secretary of Press, is, you could sort of see her as an extension of what you see today. But by the end of the book, the way perceptions are changed throughout the nation is very untraditional, is very grounded in AI itself. So the short answer is, Tatiana, we don't know yet, but I think the idea of a highly trusted news source, questionable. One final thought. One aspect of AI that I think is a potential benevolent side of this could be that AI can become, if you will, the fact checker. AI can put a stamp of approval on things. But to get to that point, we're going to have to agree how that would be done. And, as always, the question will be, well, who writes the algorithm? Who decides what's fact-checked or not? And it's not going to be as simple as Elon Musk selling you a blue check mark on your X account, formerly known as your Twitter account. I see a question.
Yeah, let's read the question, and maybe you want to take it, Elliot, and maybe Admiral, if you want to add. From Casey Roberts: how will a nation's ability to train and educate their populace affect the integration of disruptive technologies and creatively solve the geopolitical stressors that shape our world in the future? Does the adage of the best educated lead to a nation becoming a dominant power?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and I think what you see is that I think the pace of change as we get to mid-century, and already what we're living through now, is so accelerated that to keep pace with the rapidity of artificial intelligence, biological changes, technological changes that are occurring. I think nations really need to be able to not only educate the younger generations, but re-educate those who are already getting who are already moving on, and potentially retrain their workforces. So I think we've certainly seen this in the U.S. as as we've become a deindustrialized nation that's having conversations right now about how to reindustrialize. But really, education also gets the idea of just how a country is postured to deal with the changes that are coming, and the pace at which we anticipate them arriving in the future. I think is really going to put a lot of stress on the education systems in countries across the globe. So I think that's a big question. I have small children, and I often ask myself whether or not they're getting the best educations they can possibly get.
Yeah, and I'll add to that in two ways. One is, again, this is an area where AI may end up being incredibly beneficial by providing a presence, potentially an embedded presence, so such that, for example, you don't need to learn computer-aided design, you don't need to learn Spanish. It's embedded in a chip that's come into your body. And Elon Musk, who has now been mentioned more times than he deserves in this conversation, but is certainly talking and thinking about those kinds of things. And yeah, that's part of what we sort of interrogate in 2054. So AI may be very helpful and may really change how education is, shall we say, delivered. And then the second point, on a more prosaic level, just one thing I always mention at this point in a conversation, I hold up my iPhone and I ask people, how old are your children when you put one of these supercomputers in their hands? And the answer is, in today's world, on average, a child is picking that device up at about a little over 10 years old. And that's dangerous, in my view. And so my point is, part of how we educate has got to be to educate the youngest, most vulnerable amongst us in what's coming in terms of AI. And again, as we all know, this device can communicate point to point anywhere in the world. It can play any symphony ever recorded. It can show any film. It can access all the world's knowledge instantly. And yet it can also drag you into a cesspool of pornography and filth. So we have some serious work to do in education, starting right now where we are. And at some point, I think AI is going to be a deeply important part of the delivery mechanism for all the things we've just talked about.
Admiral, if I could just pick up on that, because when you held up your phone, and I have mine sitting here, this is a device that has essentially democratized. It's accessible to pretty much anyone on the planet. Even in poor countries, people can get a version of this, whether it's a U.S. or a Chinese version. Uh, with some of these other technologies, as they're developing, do you see a gap opening up that we'll have technology haves and technology have-nots? That some people will have access to much better medical care and others will not. And how does that play out? I know that's not as much. I thought detected some themes of that in the book. I mean, it wasn't, that the divisions and the like. But how do you see that playing out? Is it that we're all going to have access to this, or some will have access and others will not?
First of all, we really dive into that in 2084, because that's when so much of this kind of comes home to roost and ends up in a geopolitical conflict that stems from inequality, that itself has stemmed from lack of attention to climate and all of the precursors that we're talking about. But I think in terms of today's world, yes, we have enormous divisions already. And one of the things I do in my role as chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, we are going aggressively to get energy, clean energy, into the hands of the approximately 1/3 of the world that doesn't have access to this and is therefore falling further and further behind deeply in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia and other parts of the global South. We feel at Rockefeller that the more we can do to provide electricity and therefore access to the internet is the key to solving that still very extant gap between the haves and the have-nots.
I think that's important for us to look at that, and also to think about what events are happening now that might change how you're seeing your books, right? So we're talking about 2084 and how, some threads from here. And I know when we discussed last time you were here, how some events made you change some things in 2034. There, the pandemic, some diff players, in real life dying, and right. So you had to pivot. Was there anything like that for this book, or I don't know, the Russian war in Ukraine, Elliot, or anything?
I'd say one of the really nice things about this book, and I think makes it feel different from 2034, is that in 2034, we were sort of dealing with a nearer horizon. So anything that changed in, at that time it was really 2019, 2020 when we were writing it, was certainly going to echo 14 years out. But as we enter 2054, we're just sort of on the fringes of science fiction. So you don't feel the changes in terms of news headlines today affecting the narrative in 2054. What affects it is really these macro trends. And we can see those, pretty clearly projecting out from today. And by the time we get to 2084, we're certainly firmly fixed in the realm of science fiction. So I think one of the things that's been fun about this series for us to write is we're kind of writing across genre as we put these books together, but we're also asking the readers to come with us across genre. We're not asking you to read a trilogy that's a sci-fi trilogy. We're asking you to write a trilogy that sort of shape shifts as you go book to book. And the thing that is consistent throughout are these characters, and you're watching sort of an entire lineage go from a near future that feels very much like the present into a distant future that feels very much like science fiction. And I hope, I think we both have that's sort of part of the fun of the series.
Admirable. There were some fun things that we could expect in terms of the science fiction-y part of the book in 2054 already. Can you tell us one that doesn't give anything away that you thought was fun or that you thought of to put in there as you imagined what life might be in 2054?
Yeah, the one that I like the best is that when you land at an airport, you get on a people mover and you just flow out the door. Nobody stops and checks your passport. Nobody makes you look into a camera. It's just all happening around you as you go through the zeitgeist. It's sad for the TSA team. They're no longer with us in 2054 because we've got all this sophisticated ability to sort of capture all that. So that's one fun one. And the other one, without giving anything away, I think I'll say that the power of dreams, literally, you go to sleep and you have a dream and you're trying to understand. And we've all had this feeling of being in the midst of something that's just beyond our understanding. And you wake up and you reach for it and it just slips away from you. But in 2054, a couple of very interesting things happen to the characters that come to them in their dreams. And that's a very conscious echo of Shakespeare. And we are such stuff as dreams are made on, our little lives are rounded in a sleep. A lot happens subconsciously for us. In 2054, we have a chance to actually grasp that from time to time. That's a second thing. Elliot, am I missing anything?
No, I like that Shakespeare quote. We should have put it in the book.
Speaking of process, and as we're waiting for our final questions, as we round out our hour with you, we do ask your audience, please send them in. We'll read them out and get you to talk to the Admiral and Elliot. I wanted to see kind of what your process is like. So, you share chapters, you share ideas, but what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, do you text with this idea of, hey, we should go through TSA, seamlessly, or, how does that work? And seriously, coming together and writing a book, because that is not easy at all.
we sit down and we have pretty extensive story meetings, and we've written all of these books the same way from the outset of 2034, which is chapter by chapter. And we sit down at the beginning of each chapter, well, at the beginning of each book, and I think we have a broader sense of what the book is about. Then, as we're sort of in the trenches of writing it, we outline each chapter in a lot of detail. We know who the characters are, and then at a certain point, once we feel like we know what's going on in each chapter, one of us will take a first crack at it. That's usually me. Then I'll pass it to Jim. Sort of with the chapter written, some of my notes in it. What I'm hoping he'll fill in. He'll pass it back to me, and we'll kind of kick the chapters back and forth between the two of us until we feel like, we've got a really solid first draft and we're on terra firma. And then we move to the next chapter, and that's worked for us, and it's how we've written all the books, and I think had a lot of fun doing it that way. So if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Admiral, does anything ever not go in the books? Like, is there something that, or, how do you know that it's done? Or is there always something that you wanted to put in? Or now that you have a third book, hey, it'll go in there.
Yeah, writing a series is great. It's like renovating a house, and you can always add on, right? And in terms of anything that hit the cutting room floor, we wanted very consciously not to write The Winds of War by Herman Wouk, or War and Peace, where you need, like, in the front of the book, like a genealogy and pronunciation guide for all the characters. We wanted to write books that had like 5 principal characters. And so it would have been fun, and we kicked around at times having yet another character from yet another country to kind of carry that part of the story. And I think a runner-up might have been a European, as we talked about. But no, I don't think we want to add any more to the book. I think they're relatively tight. They're quick reads. You can get the 5 principal characters in both books in your head very quickly. And I think you develop real affection for the characters, as we spoke about a moment ago. The only other thing I could say is that we kicked around having more kind of tech, science fiction-y, kind of describing society and making it really different, kind of the Jetsons. That just didn't appeal to us ultimately. And I think the best novels about the future avoid doing that, frankly. Behind me on my bookshelf is a wonderful book. I have, I think, 10 first editions by Kazuo Ishiguro, Nobel laureate, British Japanese writer, and his most recent book is called Clara and the Sun, and it's a book about artificial intelligence and I don't want to go through it all, but the point is, the world really isn't that different, and I think it can be very distracting if a book about the future is trying to explain all the technology to you, and you get back into that straitjacket of nonfiction, because then people say, well, no, there's no way by 2054 you'll be able to do X, Y, or Z. So I think this is a long way of saying I'm quite satisfied with what's in the book, and we haven't jammed in too many Characters or too much technology. That's how I see it. Elliot, did it feel differently, Elliot?
No, I agree. I would only just emphasize that I think if we were to have rewriting a work of historical fiction, we probably wouldn't spend a whole bunch of time telling you how bread was made in the 1800s. Like, it kind of would feel irrelevant to the characters and the immediacy of how people were living their lives, and you would just sort of gesture to what life felt like as you went through the story. And I sort of think that spirit is sort of how we wanted to treat the future that we were writing, is to not get not bog the reader down into a bunch of technological details that are exogenous to the characters in the story.
Absolutely. And we have one question coming in our tail end of our conversation from Patrick McLaren. How have you viewed tools, Elliot, like ChatGPT today with regards to your writing process?
Is this when we tell you that the whole book was actually created by an AI? You'll never know.
I will say, and this goes to sort of Tatiana's question from earlier. I think, one of the things that has been, I think, a lot of fun for us in writing these books is that the conversation around the subjects in which we're writing change over the course of the creation of the book. So when we began this book, and we were, really having these deep conversations about AI and how it would affect our democracy, and how those technologies would move forward. It was sort of I think, the moment when Chat GPT really came into popular consciousness. So as we were sort of working through these books, this was at least coming into popular consciousness. So I would say, with regards to our process, it didn't have a huge effect on me because we don't use Chat GPT. But
on the record.
Yeah, on the record. But with regards to how it affected our understanding of how these issues were going to alter society, our conception of just how we create as a species, how we live with these technologies, I feel like we started really feeling how just, and finally feeling a little bit vindicated, like, yes, this is truly going to be a profound change for humanity as we enter this age of artificial intelligence, and we're standing here right now at the dawn of it.
Yeah, and I'll pick up. I think that's the right answer to Patrick's excellent question. I just wanted to make a point about, and you asked it earlier about events in the world and did it change perceptions, and certainly the events of 6th January here in the United States and the storming of the Capitol were occurring while we were writing the book. And so the portions of the book that deal, I think quite solidly with civil conflict in America were very influenced by that. And Elliot, I've been meaning to ask you this, and I'll just ask it here in this fora, but do you remember where we were in the book when the 6th January thing actually happened? Had we written that or sketched that out, or was that before or after we wrote that section? Do you remember? Because I honestly don't.
I think we're sort of in the midst, without spoiling the book. I think we were sort of in the midst of the situation deteriorating in Washington, D.C. and working through those details as 6th January happened. But yes, this is certainly, and just this entire project has at times felt a little bit like, for us, as we open the newspaper, like life imitating art. But that's been part of the fun of it.
Yeah. And as people say to me all the time about 2034, and now they're saying it about 2054, the consistent thing I get is this stuff is already happening, guys. And my response to that is, I just hope it stays on the fiction bestseller list, doesn't drift over to the nonfiction side.
Well, I think that is a great note to leave our conversation. Thank you so much, Admiral and Elliot. Sure. Their new book, 2054, but also get 2034, because you don't have to read them in order, but you should.
Yeah.
You should.
And let the record show that Elliot Ackerman drank a Negroni during this show and did not carve out time for the Admiral to go make his Negroni. So I'm going to go have a Negroni in your honor, Marie.
Well deserved. Thank you
so much,
everybody.
Thanks for being on with us. That was fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.